Welcome to the Liberated Equestrian podcast and community. This is a place for horsewomen to experience belonging, breakthrough, and becoming. I'm your host, Lisa Pulliam, founder of StableMinded.us, mental health professional, second season equestrian, and author of Finding Calm, helping riders navigate through fear and anxiety. The Liberated Equestrian is devoted to the mission of being set free and experiencing breakthroughs in every aspect of our horsemanship and humanship. This is all about mind, body, heart, and soul care for ourselves, our horses, and the people we do life with, so that we can grow together as a community of emotionally and relationally healthy horsewomen. So find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let's embark on this journey of becoming liberated equestrians together. So in today's episode of the Liberated Equestrian, I want to dive into trauma. What is trauma, and how does a trauma-informed understanding of horsemanship and humanship make a difference in how we show up in the world and what we expect of ourselves? As we unpack this, it is the foundation for where we're going as liberated equestrians. It's this understanding, this neuropsychological, neurobiological understanding of how your mind and your body show up in the world, and also how your horse's mind and body shows up in this world, that will influence the decisions that you're going to make and how you care for yourself personally, as a horse person, professionally, relationally, all the things. We take a trauma-informed understanding of life. And what do I mean by trauma-informed? So trauma is a buzzword, right? People are throwing it around left and right. But to be trauma-informed basically says, I recognize how the body responds to the need for survival. I would say made for survival, but I would say responds to the imminent need for survival. And we see this in our horses really easily in the way that they either shut down or take flight or freeze, or just their different behavior patterns. We're a little bit uneducated, let's say, or unaware of how our own survival system is kicking into gear. We've normalized things that activate the sympathetic nervous system into a survival state. And this is not my own language, it's something I've learned throughout my training. But survival is meant to be a state, not a trait. So when we are in a constant state of stress and we have complex situations that have happened in our life that makes us feel and perceive the threat of harm, we can end up living in survival as a trait. It becomes like part of our personality rather than just something that is activated for the moment and settles back down. And so having a trauma-informed lens enables us to start thinking about, how does my body perceive that? How does my mind perceive what is happening to me? And then what can I do to ground and regulate and find calm in my body and in my mind so that I can think more clearly? So I will say this probably 1,000 times on the podcast, and I'm going to kick it off here. So the simplest model for understanding how the nervous system works is what we call the hand model. And it's a combination of Bruce Perry and Dan Siegel, who are leading trauma-informed professionals in the psychology field. And the concept is this, that if you hold up your hand and put your thumb across your palm and put your fingers down over your thumb, there's your brain. And the wrist part of your brain is your amygdala. That's the alarm system that fires under a perceived threat of harm. So somebody else may not perceive it as harm, but you do. And you might perceive it as emotional harm or physical harm. So anything that threatens your pride can be perceived as harm. Any scary object coming your way, a car flying down the highway in the wrong direction, a horse taking off, somebody jumping out and scaring you, that's a physical threat of harm. And so when the amygdala fires, your nervous system activates you into flight mode or fight mode, or freeze mode. And if we look at polyvagal theory, which we'll do down the line, then it's activating you into potentially shut down and dissociation behaviors. So that is a great neurological response, right? Like, boom, your body moves into action. That's when you're going to notice you're going to be sweating, your belly's going to be flip-flopping, your heart's going to be racing, your mouth's going to become dry, your hands going to become sweaty. Same thing happens when you're about to take an exam, whether you're in high school or grad school. When you're anticipating a really hard conversation, your nervous system activates, and that sympathetic portion of your autonomic nervous system is moving into action. And the goal is it moves into action and then it comes back down, and you come back to that parasympathetic state, which is your rest and digest state. And these things should happen fluidly all day long, right? When you get stuck, what happens when you go into that fight flight mode and that alarm goes off, the thinking part of your brain basically flips the lid. And so the thinking part is your neocortex, and also your prefrontal cortex, which is your executive functioning. And so you can't think clearly when you're activated in this alarm survival state. So there's two other regions of the brain that are often referred to in this trauma-informed lens. And the idea is we want to have an integrated brain, so we pay attention to these other two parts. One of these parts, which is like the next layer up, kind of picture your thumb across the palm of your hand. The next layer up is your diencephalon, and that is responsible for your five senses and movement. And then the next layer up is your limbic system, and we think about that as your emotions, and I often call it the relationship connection. So when you flip your lid, the way to come back into a grounded moment does require some thinking capacity, but a more effective approach is to activate that diencephalon by movement and senses. That kind of brings you back into your brain, brings you back into your body, and levels you out. And the limbic system, the emotions, if you can find connection with somebody else, the nervous system benefits from this co-regulation. And so all of it, when it's acting as a healthy unit, allows us to respond to situations, think more clearly, and then come back instead of just reacting again and again and again. A beautiful picture of this is when a baby is crying, and the mom, let's say the primary caregiver mom, hears that baby crying, picks up that baby and starts rocking the baby and patting the baby, right? So the baby's in some little mini state of alarm, which is normal. They're hungry, they're tired, their diaper's dirty, they are expressing themselves. I just had coffee with two young moms and a 6-month-old infant, and I saw this happening over and over again. And the mom attuned to the baby's cries and needs and kept responding in an appropriate way. Couldn't satisfy the need immediately, but responded in an appropriate way. And often it was the pat, 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 and the rocking and the pickup. And oftentimes the little girl, she would go when the need was met. And then the neocortex. So when that happens, the child has moved from that brainstem response into that diencephalon response, into that limbic system response with the connection of mom. And then the neocortex comes back on, and the baby says, internal, it's an internal, unspoken, I'm safe here. And the I'm safe here kind of comes out with a, and I saw this over and over again. And each time it had to be met in a different way, depending upon what the core need was of that child. This is the process of our neural pathways being developed. And so going back to this idea of trauma, when we have experienced trauma from an early age, and that could be big T trauma, abuse, neglect, it could be accidents, it could be world issues, like things like catastrophes that are outside of human doing, but weather catastrophes, or maybe maybe human doing, like war, when we experience those events and they're single, they may not be lodged in us and unrepairable. And when those things happen and there is the presence of caring adults helping us navigate through those stressors, the impact of long-term trauma is minimized. But most of us in this world have experienced not only these big T traumas, but we've experienced a series of small T traumas, little fender benders. We have experienced financial struggles. We've experienced the split of our parents' marriage. And in many cases, that's a big T trauma, depending upon your age and stage. We've experienced a hunger for a period of time. In Finding Calm, I have a whole list of the different types of traumas that we can experience. And really, at the end of the day, it's how your body has processed what you have been through that impacts how you show up presently. This is why we talk about trauma. We want to understand really, let's throw the trauma word away. What is your coping strategy for stress? What resiliency strategies do you have for coming down after a scary moment? What mindset do you have around preparedness versus hypervigilance? And understanding how you show up in this world is going to directly impact how you navigate through things with your horse. It's going to impact what you expect of your horse and what you expect of yourself, how you process things like a fall or a runaway situation with the horse, or even the horse just kicking out and on the cross ties in impatience and it gets your shin. Like, how you respond to these situations is going to have a lot to do with how trigger stacked you are in the current environment that you're living in personally and in your barn environment, and then how much trigger stacking has there been throughout your whole life. So right now you might be like, oh my gosh, who hasn't dealt with trauma, and how do I even like dig out of this? Okay, so here's the hope and here's the good news. This is why I am so passionate about trauma-informed work and trauma-informed understanding in our humanship and horsemanship. Because when we are in the presence of other individuals and other horses in which we can experience grounded, safe, co-regulating interaction, it's healing. It is transforming of us. And when we feel safe in those environments, we can learn. And when we can learn, we can begin to develop new habits and new coping strategies and new resiliencies. And so much of what I'm going to offer you in this podcast, but also in the Patreon community and what you find in Finding Calm and the resources I have available at Stable Minded are all about building that toolkit so that you, A, have an awareness of how you show up, B, begin to learn the language and be able to identify how others show up, C, be able to see how your horse is showing up because their nervous system is wired very similarly to ours. And then you're able with this information to begin to hand pick what you need to do in order to grow and develop. And ultimately what that's going to do for you as an equestrian, as a human, is be able to help you discern what training techniques do you want to use? What style of riding and discipline most suits your personality and your past into your present? So practically speaking, like the places that you feel stuck, like when your trainer or instructor is like barking orders at you at what to do and you just freeze, well, hello, you are having a stress response in that moment and your brain is going offline. Riding a horse with your brain offline is not a good idea. You need to come back into your body. How do you come back into your body in that situation? And by the way, coming back into your body is going to enable you to move fluidly with your horse, which is going to enable your horse to feel safer and more secure. And the whole thing's going to get better. So there's a couple ways around that, right? Like, can we help you find your voice so you can say to your trainer or riding instructor, hey, I need a minute, or I need to stand here while you explain this to me because you're yelling at me in order for me just to hear you isn't actually processing in my brain right now. You can take it very neutral, like, hey, this is about me. I just need to do this in order to do what you're asking me to do. Or you might get to a point of saying, like, this person isn't going to change and I don't feel safe using my voice in this scenario. And now this explains why I haven't been progressing with my horse and I've not been progressing in my riding. And now we have to explore some other options, right? And I'm a huge advocate of, can we change me, myself, and I first before we expect everything and everyone else around us to change? Because if you don't attend the core issues and you up and relocate or up and change your horse, you're still going to show up as the same person if you are not committed to transformation of yourself from the inside out. And, as I shared in the very first episode about my own journey, that so much of how I show up as a horsewoman and as a mental health professional and just as a human is through the lens of my faith. I believe that God is a God of transformation. And for those of you who are Christians and have a scope of scripture understanding, I really go back to Ezekiel 36:26, where the scriptures say God will take a heart of stone and transform it to a heart of flesh. And that has been my story and experience, like hands down. Like, God took a very angry, hurt, bruised, battered, insecure, overwhelmed little girl named Lisa, who grew up to embody all of that until she came face to face with caring, loving humans. And through those relationships, God began to chip away at my hardened heart and show me places that I needed to seek his love and healing work in, places that I needed to forgive others, places that I needed to ask for forgiveness. And that's not a once and done, right? Those have happened, those experiences have happened one on top of the other on top of the other for the last 30 years of my life. And so how I show up now is so very different than how I showed up 30 years ago. I am evidence of transformation. And yet, the old me still shows up when I'm scared. It shows up when I feel criticized. It shows up when I feel overwhelmed and unsafe. And the difference between now and before I started doing the equine assisted therapy work with clients, which meant I had to do my own work and go through my own training process, was that I have an awareness of what's happening in my body and through what's coming out of my mouth. And the scriptures say, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. That I'm able to kind of take a pause and say, what's happening here? And sometimes that pause requires work with my own therapist to figure out, okay, help me make sense of these pieces. Sometimes that pause just comes through my time sitting with God and journaling and reading scriptures. Sometimes it requires a conversation with one of my best friends. Sometimes it shows up in the saddle. It's been amazing to watch that transpire with Kodiak, especially, that he is so in tune with my emotions and so in tune where I hold my tension. And he basically has like taught me to get more in touch with my body so that we can move more fluidly together. And one of the big helps with that is this was a profound experience at Concordia Stables, which is where Cody and I exist. There's a horse called Joker, and Joker is what we would call a spring horse. And so you can pop a saddle on the back of the horse, and through your movement, you can simulate the movements of a trot and a canter. And so I've had quite a few joker lessons. They're great for when the weather is terrible. They're great for working on balance and for paying attention to body movement. And you're really only dealing with just the rider rather than the compensatory patterns of the horse. And through that, we really saw how much my hands are activated not only when I don't feel balanced, which was a kick in my butt to get some core strength, but also when I feel anxious and tense, it shows up 100% in my hands. And I couldn't feel what that was like until I had a few joker lessons and in-hand lessons with my trainer holding the bridle and I'm holding the reins, and we go back and forth with that. And what ended up happening was I started noticing the other times of my day in which my hands hold the tension. And that awareness made me realize, like, oh, I need to do some grounding work. I need to do some mental work here. I need to do some relaxation work here, because there are things happening inside of me that I don't have words for, and it is impacting my decision making. It's impacting how I hear what other people say. It's impacting the tone I use when I interact with others. And it was an awareness and an aha that came from riding Cody, because he is very, as a racehorse, very opinionated about the pressure from my hands to the bit. And he's entitled to have that experience. And so that is one of the ways that understanding humanship through a mental health lens, through a trauma-informed lens, through understanding what's happening between our mind and our body. They're one piece. They're not two separate pieces. Our nervous system doesn't just like stop at a certain point in our body and the rest of it doesn't exist. So what we feel, what we think, what we sense are all part of our holistic package in how we show up in the world. And our horse is the same way. Like, think about my little story here about Kodiak Jack, is that he was a racehorse, and thoroughbreds who race are taught to go on the pressure of the bit. So we were a hot mess together, because he thinks I'm saying go and I'm fighting him in my body, but my hands are telling him one thing, my body is telling him something else, and he's frustrated with me. And he's just operating in the neural pathways of his upbringing. In my interactions with Cody, I had to understand him. I had to understand his context. I had to understand what he was saying. And I had to adapt to that. I had to work on me in order to help us grow together. And isn't that the truth of all relationships? Isn't that what we need to do with every human we're in relationship with, is not only listening to the horse, but also listening to the human? And so I hope this big picture of trauma, understanding how the nervous system works, understanding how that shows up in when we're working with our horses in this really high level overview, gives you a picture of some of the things you can start looking for when you are being the equestrian that you're called to be. I want to end actually with this quote from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. So he wrote the book Body Keeps the Score. It is phenomenal. It's a hard read. Feel free to do the audio version of it. He writes, trauma robs you of the feeling that you are in charge of yourself, of what I call self-leadership. The challenge of recovery is to establish ownership of your body and your mind, and of yourself. This means feeling free to know what you know and feel what you feel without becoming overwhelmed, enraged, ashamed, and collapsed. For most people, this involves 1, finding a way to become calm and focused, and 2, learning to maintain that calm in response to images, thoughts, sounds, or physical sensations that remind you of the past. And 3, finding a way to be fully alive in the present and engaged with people around you And lastly, 4, not having to keep secrets from yourself, including secrets about the way you have managed to survive. This, to me, was one of my most favorite quotes that I've read in Bessel's book. And it is the embodiment of all the things that we hold as people becoming liberated equestrians. It's this, who am I? How am I showing up? How am I free to show up in light of what I've been through and what I need in this moment and moving forward? And then how do I also give this liberation a gift to the horse that I have the opportunity to love and care for, whether that's a horse you own, lease, get to lesson on. We all have heart horses. We all have that desire to make life better for the horses that we're with. And honestly, that starts with a commitment to your humanship before pursuing your horsemanship. And that is my passion for you at the Liberated Equestrian. Hop over to the Liberated Equestrian Patreon, which is patreon.com/Liberated Equestrian, to get actively involved in the community and access the supports that you need in order to stabilize and thrive, both personally and professionally. I look forward to supporting you on this journey. Let's be liberated as equestrians together. You can learn more about the Liberated Equestrian podcast, as well as the services I have available to help you grow, stabilize, and thrive at stableminded.us and at theliberatedequestrian.us. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Be sure to give our podcast, yes, it's ours, because we're growing this community together, a thumbs up and a star and a like in your favorite listening app. Until next time, go, be free, be liberated, and be the human you were meant to be. The Liberated Equestrian podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only. The content shared in each episode, including discussions, interviews, and advice, reflects the personal opinions and professional insights of the host and guest. The information provided on this podcast is not a substitute for professional mental health care, counseling, or therapy. Listeners should consult a licensed healthcare professional for specific advice regarding their personal situations. Reliance on any information provided by this podcast is solely at the listener's discretion and risk. While every effort is made to provide accurate and up-to-date information, neither Lisa Pulliam nor the Liberated Equestrian podcast assumes any responsibilities for errors, omissions, or outcomes resulting from the use of this information. By listening to this podcast, you agree that neither the host, guest, or affiliated party shall be held liable for any damages, loss, or harm arising from the use or misuse of the information presented. If you are experiencing a mental health emergency, please seek immediate assistance from a qualified healthcare provider or call your emergency services in your area. Thank you for listening to the Liberated Equestrian podcast.